President.
Senator from Wisconsin.
Madam President, as I've been here now for a little more than 18 months, and I've been listening to the debate on spending and taxes and our debt and deficit, I came to the floor this morning with a few visual aids, some charts, some graphs, to try and dispel some of the myths that I've been hearing. And the first myth that I constantly hear is about the draconian cuts being proposed in the House budget. I think this chart pretty well dispels that myth by showing that 10 years ago, in 2002, the federal government spent $2 trillion. This year, we will spend about $3.8 trillion. We've doubled spending in just 10 years. And the debate moving forward is under the House budget, they would spend $4.9 trillion. President Obama's budget proposes spending $5.8 trillion. And I think it's pretty clear to see in this chart that nobody's proposing, net cuts in spending. We're just trying to limit the rate of growth in spending. Another way of looking at spending is over 10 years. And just quickly, in the 1990s, the federal government over a 10-year period spent $16 trillion. The last decade, from 2002 through 2011, the federal government spent $28 trillion. And again, the debate moving forward is, over the next 10 years, do we spend $40 trillion, as the House budget proposes, or do we spend $47 trillion? Again, no cuts, just trying to reduce the rate of growth. Well, let's just talk a little bit about what the federal government has spent under the current administration. Over the 4 years of President Obama's administration, the federal government in total will spend $14.4 trillion. Think back to that last graph. That's almost as much as we spent in the decade of the 1990s. The entire deficit for that time period is $5.3 trillion. In other words, we had to borrow 5.3 of the $14.4 trillion that we spent. That's about 37 cents of every dollar spent we borrowed. We put that debt burden on the backs of our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren. Now, often I hear that the whole problem with the deficit is being caused by the war costs or the 2001-2003 tax cuts. And so we've added those to the chart here. You can see the total amount over that 4-year period of the overseas contingents, the overseas war costs and the Bush tax cuts was $1.2 trillion, less than 25% of the total deficit. So again, they're a factor, but they are not what caused the deficit. What caused the deficit primarily is spending. This chart basically shows what has been happening over the last 50 years. The structural deficit that we have incurred is a basic result of, on average, federal government spending has been about 20.2% from 1959 to 2008, prior to this administration. On the other hand, revenue generation has averaged about 18.1%, which gives us a 2.1% structural deficit. That's why our debt has continued to grow. But under this administration, starting with the recession, that structural deficit exploded, with tax revenue dropping to about 15% and spending skyrocketing to 25%, now about 24%. But it's on a trajectory to hit 35% by the year 2035. Clearly, that's unsustainable. Another way of taking a look at the tax cuts of 2001 and 2003 in terms of their total effect on our deficit figure is to actually put them on a bar chart. The red bars represent the total deficit. The blue portions on the bottom of those red charts are the actual reductions in revenue from those tax cuts. And you can see it's not a very large figure. In total, over that that's an 11-year time period, the total Bush tax cuts were about $1.7 trillion, while the entire deficit was about $7.5 trillion. So the tax cuts represented about 22% of that total deficit. But again, when you take a look at the last 4 years, a far smaller portion of the deficit, because the primary deficit over the last 4 years has been on the spending side of the equation. Now, what does the president offer for solutions? Well, last year, he proposed the Buffett Rule. And in September, in a speech on September 26th, in proposing the Buffett Rule, he basically said that basic principle of fairness that he said the Buffett Rule was, he said if that was applied to our tax code, it could raise enough money to not only do we pay for his jobs bill, but we also stabilize our debt and deficits for the next decade. And think about what President Obama said there. He said that the Buffett Rule would not only pay for his jobs bill, but would stabilize our debt and deficits for the next decade. Now, here's a chart. Here's the fact. The Buffett Rule, for 4 years of the Buffett Rule, it's projected would raise about $20 billion total. President Obama's 4 years of deficit is $5.3 trillion, or let's state it a different way, $5,300 billion. Now, it doesn't take a math major to realize that $20 billion doesn't even come close to stabilizing a deficit of $5,300 billion. President Obama misled the American people. I think the President of the United States has a far higher duty to the American people. He should be honest with them. Now, last week we debated the other tax proposals proposed by our friends on the other side of the aisle here. And in proposing this and actually, unfortunately, passing this piece of tax legislation, the majority leader said that that piece of legislation is about debt. It is about the debt, he said. We have to do something about the debt. And we have tried mightily to do that. We have tried mightily. Well, again, let's take a look at the facts. The first year of that tax legislation, and it's really the only year that counts, would have raised $67 billion compared to last year's deficit of $1,326 billion. Is that really trying mightily to fix the debt and deficit? I don't think so. If you were really serious about fixing our debt and deficit situation, if you were trying mightily to do that, you might have tried passing a budget in the last 3 years. You might have actually put appropriation bills and brought them to the floor so they could be debated and passed, and then conferenced with the House and signed into law, so we're not faced with what we're faced right now, is having to pass a continuing resolution to fund the government in 2013. So again, dispel the myth. The Democrats' tax proposal would do nothing, almost nothing, to stabilize their debt and deficit. It's simply a political exercise. It's political demagoguery. It's class warfare. And I really ask the American people to consider a simple question. If they're really for increasing taxes on the productive sector of our economy, those small businesses, those million small businesses that would be affected by this, the money that would be taken out of those small businesses that they would use to expand their business, to buy capital equipment, to increase wages, pay for health care, invest in 401k plans. It does not stabilize the debt and deficit. It does nothing to that. I think Republicans basically agree with President Obama and President Clinton. Back on August 5th, 2009, just as we were coming out of a recession, President Obama said, "You don't raise taxes in a recession." I agree with that. Republicans agree with that. Back in December, or this is actually November and December of 2010, right after the lame duck session when all the tax rates were extended for 2 years, President Obama said, if we allow these taxes to go up, the economy would grow less. He was right. Back then, by the way, average growth in our economy was about 3.1%. The last 4 quarters now, the economy's only grown about 2%. Our economy is in worse shape. It only grew at 1.5% in the last quarter. You can see the downward trajectory. And of course, President Clinton also said that probably the best thing we could do is extend all the tax rates. Take that level of uncertainty off the table. And that's really what Republicans are proposing. Let's not increase taxes on any American at this point in time. Let's not threaten any kind of government shutdown. Let's, as much as fiscal conservatives do not like the Budget Control Act or those spending limits, we think it's just reasonable policy to pass a 6-month continuing resolution, so that a responsible leader can come into this town and actually start fixing our debt and deficit situation. So that's, I believe, what Republicans are all about, is taking the uncertainty of a shutdown off the table, taking the uncertainty of what people's tax rates will be over the next year, being responsible. And with that, Madam President, I yield the floor.